Hello everyone and welcome to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's reach 50 subscribers until the end of this month. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. My mother did not love me. I don't blame her for it. It's hard to blame a stool for not having a backrest, isn't it? If it had a backrest, it would be a chair. If my mother loved me, she wouldn't be my mother. At least she didn't have an abortion or abandon me at the hospital. I was fed, clothed, and as for love, well, the heart wants what it wants. Maybe it was partly my fault. If I had been gentler with her, perhaps she might have thawed, but even as a child, I was somewhat cold emotionally. My mother was an artist. She painted strange abstract interweavings of polygons that made my head spin just to look at them. Apparently, she was talented, as she had a few regular customers, and we were never without money. My father, it seemed, was also part of the artistic crowd, but my mother didn't like to talk about him, and I didn't insist. We lived in a 2-room apartment. My mother painted and slept in the larger room, while the smaller room was formerly mine. Formerly, because I only used it to sleep. My days went like this. I woke up, my mother fed me breakfast, gave me some money, and sent me off to school. After school, I ate lunch in the cafeteria, then went to the library, where I did my homework in the reading room, strolled around the streets of our town, had dinner in the cafeteria, strolled again, and came home late at night to sleep. In winter, I spent more time in libraries, and later joined a woodworking club. In spring, autumn, and summer, I was mostly outdoors. Staying at home during the day was strongly discouraged by my mother. She did everything she could to drive me outside. My room was merely a place to sleep and store my clothes. I wasn't allowed to have personal items beyond what was strictly necessary for school. One winter, I fell in with a group of peers. I didn't form close friendships with any of them, but playing together was fun. One day, we dug a cave in a large snowdrift. Over time, the cave expanded into a huge grotto, taking up almost all the space in the snowdrift. It had a ceiling reinforced with planks, a window covered with a piece of plexiglass, and one of my companions brought a small, samovar-like stove. We stoked it with kindling. It roared and glowed red hot. Our snow house became warm and even cozy. In that moment, I felt something strange, something I had never felt before. Domestic comfort? No, not quite that, just a faint shadow of it, a completely unfamiliar feeling. And suddenly, I realized what I needed to do. I needed to make myself a home. I started saving on lunches, which made me lose a little weight by spring, but my pocket grew a bit heavier. As soon as the snow melted, I went to the hardware store, bought an axe, rope, a few meters of polyethylene film, and some other odds and ends, then headed to the forest. There was plenty of forest around our town. During summer vacations, I often visited it, both alone and with the occasional friend, so I knew the trails fairly well. I mentally mapped out a place not too far from the town, but remote enough from the trails to avoid accidental encounters, and headed there. I found a suitable spot, drove in a couple of poles, and stretched the polyethylene film between them. Crawling into the makeshift tent, I lay down on freshly picked grass. No, it wasn't right. I needed something more to evoke that feeling I had in the snow house. A tent was just a place to lie down, not a home where I could stand tall and stretch out my arms. I spent the whole summer building a house. First, I made a frame from aspens and birches about the thickness of my wrist. Surprisingly, it turned out quite sturdy, despite being my first construction attempt. I covered the frame with polyethylene film, creating something like a greenhouse 2 by 3 meters in size. I didn't like it. It was stuffy, overheated in the sun, and felt like sitting in a transparent aquarium, not cozy at all. I decided to build something sturdier. About 2 kilometers from my construction site was a dump where, among other things, sawmill waste was discarded, including low-quality slabs of wood. Most of it was rotten or entirely decayed, but with some digging, I could find decent boards. I adapted an abandoned baby stroller from the dump for transport. One end of a bundle of boards went onto it, the other end onto a strap slung over my shoulder. Then I hauled them, first through a ravine, then through a forest full of fallen trees, always by a different route to avoid leaving a revealing trail, across a stream, uphill, resting along the way, hammering the boards into place, and then back for another load. I managed 3 trips a day. During construction, I made an important discovery. It turns out that if you buy a pack of pasta and a can of tomato stewed sprats, or canned stew, or mackerel in oil, or something else, cook the pasta over a campfire in a large coffee tin, mix it, and eat it, it's not only cheaper and tastier, it really is tastier, but also somehow more homely, isn't it? The same elusive feeling I'd experienced in the snow house drove me to build this home. And tea. A pinch of the cheapest granulated tea brewed in a tin can with 5 sugar cubes, smoky from the fire, under the chirping birds. It wasn't anything like the cafeteria. It was much cheaper, too, so I started saving even more of my food allowance. By early August, the house wasn't fully finished. Actually, to skip ahead, I never stopped working on it, constantly repairing, upgrading, and expanding, but it was ready enough for me to spend the night in. It already had walls made of crooked, low-quality slabs, covered outside with roofing felt and burlap, and inside with thick cardboard from packing boxes. It had a roof of real, albeit old, shingles, a window with only one crack. I got lucky and found an inner frame with intact glass, probably from someone renovating their summer house, and a lockable door on brand new hinges. The door was thick and heavy. I hadn't calculated well when I nailed the boards crosswise. The floor wasn't installed yet, that came later, but I already had furniture, a kind of bench couch made from a couple of logs and planks, and a table cobbled together from 2 empty wooden crates. "Mom, can I sleep over at Jonah's tonight? We'll play video games," and I asked my mother. Yes, of course," she replied with undisguised joy. "Can I stay there tomorrow, too? And the day after tomorrow, I'll come back." "Of course, you can." That day, I spent nearly all my savings. At the sports goods store, I bought a sleeping bag, surprised at how cheap it was. At the household goods store, I purchased a set of dishes, a couple of faceted glasses, a small aluminum kettle, a pot, a plate, spoons, and forks. I also bought some candles and batteries for the flashlight. Back then, LED flashlights were just starting to appear, and the incandescent bulb ones drained batteries very quickly. I bought food for a couple of days and, most importantly, from a peer of mine from the company I had interacted with in the winter, I bought that very tiny potbelly stove. I still marvel at how much I managed to do that day, ran around the stores, picked up the stove, then dragged all the new junk home, spent a long time installing the stove. It turned out that its original pipe was burnt out and too short, so I adapted some other pipe about 10 centimeters in diameter that I found on the roadside. It seemed to have once been a post for a road sign. After that, I even managed to saw firewood and prepare dinner. I finished everything around midnight. Finished and finally felt how exhausted I was. I lay down on the couch, wrapped myself in the unzipped sleeping bag, turned onto my side, and looked around my little house. Mine. Only mine. Everything here was mine. Everything here was arranged exactly as I wanted. Suddenly, I felt a soft, warm jolt inside, like a second heart beating in my chest, pumping not blood but pure happiness. The sense of homey comfort, which had previously been just a phantom, a hint, suddenly arrived in all its reality. God, how wonderful it was. I stretched out my tired, aching legs and, it seemed, started to drift off. And then I felt a gaze on me. Not hostile. More like bored, almost indifferent, with just the faintest trace of curiosity. It was the kind of look I might give an ant crawling on a blade of grass. And then, that someone said softly, "I want to ask a question." It's hard to explain, but I immediately felt how enormous this observer was. Maybe taller than the tallest pine in this forest. Or maybe not taller, maybe it was enormous in depth. Like a small but massive black hole, with gravity so strong that time and space were tangled into incomprehensible knots. Was I scared? Well, to describe what I felt then, let me give an example from early childhood. I must have been about 8 or 9 years old, one dark winter evening, walking down the street when I suddenly heard the noise of a violent fight around the corner of a building. I stopped, thinking of turning back, but then a man came out from around the corner. He was about 2 meters tall, with massive shoulders, arms as thick as my neck, and wearing a thick, shaggy coat and a similarly shaggy hat, which made him seem even larger. His face was covered with a black beard nearly up to his eyes, and his eyes bore the remains of recent adrenaline. His knuckles were battered. He looked at me indifferently and walked past. Even then, at that age, I intellectually understood that there was probably no real danger. This guy had his own business, incomprehensible to me, and I, an 8-year-old boy, was no threat to him. But rational thoughts in a safe place are one thing, and being near someone who could snap your neck with 2 fingers is another. That was something like what I felt now. I froze in my sleeping bag and felt myself breaking out in cold, clammy sweat. "I want to ask a question." "Talk to me." "Who are you?" I barely managed to whisper. "I." Just I, and that was all. "Are you a person?" "No." A bored, disinterested voice. "Have I mentioned that I spent a lot of time in libraries?" Among those libraries, there was one favored by local sectarians, either Jehovah's Witnesses or some kind of evangelists, who constantly slipped their literature onto the shelves. Some of it had come into my hands recently. "Are you a demon?" "I've heard your stories about demons," said the disinterested voice with a faint shadow of interest. "No, I am not a demon." I suddenly realized that I had already asked several questions instead of answering and was terrified that the owner of the voice would get angry. "What do you want to ask?" "Why did you build this house here?" "Is this your forest?" "Sorry, I didn't know." At that moment, I imagined I was talking to some mythical forest spirit, maybe a leshy or something like that. "No," it answered, sounding slightly confused, as if the thought of whether or not this forest belonged to it had never occurred to it before. "So why did you build the house?" "People live in apartments, in cities. They build houses in villages where other people are." "Why did you build this house here?" "Because, well..." And I laid it all out. I told it about how in the apartment I had a room, but there I could only sleep, about how one winter we built a snow house, and I liked it there. So I decided to make one for myself, a place where everything was mine, just the way I wanted it, where it was cozy, where I could sit, where I could lie down, my own house. I was afraid this unknown forest spirit would tell me to leave its forest, and I would lose my newly acquired home. So, perhaps I overdid it with the emotions, trying to elicit its pity. I would have run away from this being, legs flying, and abandoned any treasure. But my pathetic little shack was more precious to me than anything I'd ever had before. When I finished talking, it left without commenting on my story. At some point, I simply felt that I was speaking into emptiness. Sleep, of course, disappeared without a trace, so I got up, lit a candle, stoked the stove, and drank tea until morning. In the morning, I thought about going home, but imagined my mother's grimace when I told her I was staying for 2 days. Since nothing scary had happened anymore, I decided to stay. I slept half the day, then had lunch, went to the junkyard a couple of times for boards, had dinner, slept, had breakfast, started laying the floor in the house, had lunch, went for more boards, continued laying the floor, and worked a little on the roof. That's how 2 days flew by. For the next 3 years, I spent a lot of time in that little house, practically living there. I'd only come to the apartment to eat, get money from my mom for food, and sleep a couple of nights a week. My mother didn't care, honestly. I suspect if I hadn't returned one day, it would have taken her a month to notice. I could tell many stories about those 3 happy years when I had a home. So much happened, a whole thick book could be written. Unfortunately, I'm not Daniel Defoe and probably couldn't make it interesting to write about how I built the house, how I lived there, what tools I bought, how I set up lighting using an old car battery, how I made a field shower, and how I camouflaged the house. It would be a thick book, and probably an interesting one, but I want to tell you about something else. About that strange being that spoke to me in the forest. The next time I heard it was 2 weeks after the nighttime conversation when I had almost convinced myself that it was a dream. I was walking from the city to the hut along a path when suddenly a disembodied voice said directly into my ear, "Don't go there today. Wait until tomorrow." I froze in place. I stood there, thought about it, turned around, and went back to the apartment. The very next morning, walking further along the path, I saw signs of a drunken picnic, a large fire pit, 3 vodka bottles, leftover kebabs, a pile of papers and cans, and several used condoms hanging from the branches. Who knows what would have happened if I had crossed their path yesterday? Maybe nothing, or maybe they would have picked on me, taken my backpack, or just punched me for fun. Another time, already in autumn, I went deeper into the forest gathering mushrooms, walking with my gaze fixed on the ground, when I suddenly heard rustling in the bushes about 15 meters away. I looked up and saw a bear. My God, how enormous it was. I remembered reading in books that when encountering a bear, you shouldn't run, but rather stand your ground and yell loudly. Stand still? Yell? Yeah, right. I bolted from there as if stung, tried to yell, but fear choked my throat. I only came to my senses by the hut. Pressing my back against the wall, I listened carefully. Was the bear chasing me? Could I hear the heavy body crashing through the bushes? Apparently not. Quiet. And in that silence, I heard laughter. Yes, that's right, an unknown forest spirit was laughing. What scared you? It said condescendingly. You're of no interest to him. The bear came here to eat raspberries, but there are few raspberries here, and they're not tasty. He'll leave soon and won't come back. I don't know how it knew such details. Perhaps it read the bear's thoughts, or maybe it simply asked and the bear answered, but somehow I knew for sure it wasn't lying. And I calmed down. There was another incident in winter. Winter that year came late. First, there was a long, warm, and dry autumn, then it finally got colder, snow fell, but even at night, the temperature didn't drop below -15 degrees. I continued to spend nights at my hut. The thickness of the walls was sufficient for such temperatures, and the small cast iron stove provided enough heat. I just had to sleep in intervals, fall asleep, wake up when it got cooler, add wood, and go back to sleep. I quickly got used to it and slept well enough. That winter day, I arrived late. Well, late for winter, it got dark earlier. I had stayed at school and trudged through a lot of snow, not having brought skis, so the trip took longer, and I reached the hut when it was almost dark. I checked the firewood stacked in the hallway. I had added a vestibule-like area to the hut using poles and plastic sheeting. The supply was low, but I shrugged it off. It was already dark, I'd economize, and it'd last until dawn, then I'd cut more. I lit the stove sparingly, as planned, adjusted the damper to slow the burning of the wood, waited for the air to warm up, took off my outerwear, and flopped onto the couch with a book. I completely forgot to mention I had an entire library. Well, at that time, it wasn't much of a library, just one book, but later, I built a whole homemade shelf. At our libraries, when it came time to discard books, they put them on a special table where anyone could take them instead of throwing them away. Sometimes, I left with a full bag. Interesting books I read, uninteresting ones, well, paper in the forest always came in handy for kindling or other purposes. If I had that shelf full of books that winter night, it probably wouldn't have survived. I lay reading under the dim light of a tiny lamp powered by a battery when I suddenly felt colder. I checked the stove, the wood hadn't burned out yet. I slightly opened the damper to make it burn more intensely and returned to reading, but for some reason, it didn't get any warmer. I opened the damper fully, the stove roared, reheated heat, but the wood burned out completely in minutes. I went to the vestibule for more wood but barely opened the door when the freezing air nearly knocked me over. I put on my jacket, a light one, comfortable at -10 in the city but far from suitable in the middle of the forest at -30 or however low the temperature had dropped that night, ran out, grabbed an armful of firewood, dragged it inside, and slammed the door shut. I stuffed the wood into the stove, almost extinguishing it with the frosty logs, but it finally caught fire, and I cocooned myself in a sleeping bag. The wind picked up outside. Not gusty, but strong and steady, relentless. There weren't any noticeable drafts, the cracks I'd stuffed thoroughly, but the thin walls froze instantly, and frost even appeared in the corners. Damn, the walls of a snow hut, where that same stove once stood, retained heat better. You're probably wondering, didn't I have more clothes? Did I really go to the forest, build a house, cut wood, and light the stove in the same jacket I wore to school? Staining it with resin, smoking it with soot, tearing it on branches? Well, yes and no. The idea of getting spare clothes came to me in the summer after the first resin stain on my jeans. That fall, I picked up a work coat of a nauseating gray color that the school shop teacher had discarded for being too worn. The teacher was skinny but tall, so the coat's hem nearly reached my ankles. I patched the holes, sewed on torn pockets, and cinched the sleeves with a couple of stitches so they wouldn't flap, wearing it like a cloak. In winter, I undid the stitches on the sleeves and wore it over my jacket. It protected against resin, branches, and soot but, alas, didn't add much warmth. Suddenly, I felt utterly miserable. As soon as the fire in the stove weakened, the temperature began to drop. The wood burned quickly, and the supply was small, and I realized that if I didn't find something to fuel the stove by morning, I would at least catch a serious cold. I threw the last batch of wood into the stove, grabbed a hacksaw, put the coat over my jacket, and stepped outside. I looked around, shining my flashlight. It was a moonless, pitch-dark winter night. Of course, I'd already cut down all the suitably sized dry wood near the hut, and the dry branches within reach I'd broken off back in the summer. I'd have to go along the trail, turn into the forest, push through the fir trees, descend into the ravine, and find some not too thick, dry pine trees there. At night. On a freezing night, the cold air took my breath away, the wind stung my face, blew through the coat and jacket, and something howled in the distance. Probably the wind, but who knows? I thought about it and went back to the hut, sawing only the top of a small fir sticking out of the snow. It was wet but had frozen sap streaks, so it caught fire poorly but did the job, though it crackled and smoked. My gaze fell on a stool. Perfect. Homemade, built from thick logs, massive and dry. I had made it in the summer, just what I needed. I sawed it up and stuffed the logs into the stove. What next? The table. Made of crates with thin planks, but it would work. And the couch. That had plenty of wood, enough to last a while. And how long is a while? Until morning for sure, even until noon the next day if I was frugal. But would it warm up by then? My mom thought I was staying at Jonah's place, playing Super Mario Brothers and eating his grandmother's pies. But Jonah didn't even know we were best friends, as I lied to my mom. And no one, absolutely no one, would come looking for me. And I suddenly felt so sorry for myself, so lost, that I cried. Whimpered like a little child. And the next second, something cracked and crashed outside, shaking the ground. I rushed out and froze in disbelief. A huge, dry pine tree, as thick as two of my scrawny bodies, had fallen right at the door of my hut. A little to the side, and it would have flattened me and the hut like a cockroach in a matchbox. Probably from the frost, I thought. Books say trees crack from frost, they probably fall too. What luck. The fall had shaken all the snow off its branches, so it wasn't hard to cut thick, resinous boughs in several trips for the entire night. I stuffed the wood into the stove, fully opened the damper until the stove roared, and one side glowed crimson. Finally, I relaxed. The next day, the temperature rose to a tolerable level, and I easily made it back to the city, though I was slightly chilled. I didn't stop visiting the hut, but I learned my lesson. I bought thick padded pants at a thrift store, a furry synthetic coat, tattered and therefore cheap, and winter boots with thick liners from a fishing store, surprisingly affordable. I also insulated the hut with makeshift materials, layers of roofing felt, rotting plywood, burlap, anything I could dig out from under the snow at the dump. The hut's exterior looked rather shabby, and in my second-hand clothes, I looked like a bum, but I was no longer afraid of the cold. And, of course, I didn't forget about the heating. I vowed to install a new, more powerful stove at the first opportunity and began stocking up on wood, specifically cutting up the conveniently fallen tree. And that's when I discovered the tree hadn't fallen from the cold at all. It hadn't been broken or split. It had been cleanly cut. Not a single splinter sticking out, a smooth cut gleaming as if polished, a straight slice, as though it weren't hard, dry wood but a soft blade of grass cut with a brand new razor. I stood there, mouth wide open in astonishment, then whispered, "Thank you." You might get the impression that the forest spirit looked after me, that we had some sort of friendly relationship. No, not at all. One night, we talked. Once, it helped me avoid an unpleasant encounter. Once, it laughed at my fright. Once, it left me firewood. All of this happened only in the first few months, while I spent 3 years at the hut, and only a couple of times during all that time did I notice its presence, felt something immense nearby, which could have been my imagination. Let's just say it was like an adult neighbor from another apartment building with whom I exchanged a few words while taking out the trash and who once chased off some bullies harassing me, nothing more. Life went on. I studied, grew up, built up my hut, made friends, quarreled, fell in love, suffered heartbreak, learned to smoke. What's there to elaborate on? Life is life. The end of the 11th grade was approaching, and I decided to apply to a university in a not-too-distant city. Naturally, it was assumed that I would live in a dormitory, not bother my mother with visits, and ideally, quickly find a job, permanent housing, and settle down there. That's more or less what happened. I got in without any issues. It wasn't Washington, after all, and within the first month, I found a decent part-time job, which soon turned into a solid full-time position. My mother sent money initially, but the dormitory didn't cause much discomfort. Even though I shared it with 3 roommates, it was still my own room, and compared to the empty one back at my apartment, it was a world of difference. Besides, my roommates turned out to be great guys. I didn't miss my mother, my apartment, or my hometown. I only missed my forest home. It's hardly an exaggeration to say that I went to bed and woke up thinking about it. I often planned to go there on weekends, to check if it was still standing, but somehow it never worked out. Either I was swamped with studies, got a lucrative job offer, or, well, got involved in romantic affairs. I planned to visit during winter break and was ready to buy a ticket when I realized I didn't have the right footwear or skis, and the ones at home were probably long gone, thrown out by my mother. Only in the spring, shortly before exams, did I finally return to my hometown and head straight to the forest from the train station. I followed the familiar trail, turned at my secret spot, walked a bit, and suddenly saw a clearing in the woods where there hadn't been one before. A wide logging corridor cut through the forest. Deep roots from heavy timber trucks, sawn logs, and heaps of branches lined it, and right where my little house once stood, there was now a sizable pit, already beginning to fill with water. I sat on the first log I saw, dropped my backpack, and clasped my head in my hands. I thought I might cry, but to my surprise, I didn't. Maybe it was meant to be. I had grown up, and that little house was part of my childhood. It's silly to cry over a lost childhood. It's silly for an adult to have a secret house in the woods. That's for teenagers. I'll have my own house someday, a real one, not this toy hut, right? No, I won't, I immediately answered myself. There will never be another house like that. Sighing, I stood up, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and headed back to the station without even stopping by my mother's place. A few days later, after staying up late with my textbooks, I finally turned off my desk lamp and lay down in bed while my roommates were already asleep. I was tired, but sleep wouldn't come. Someone upstairs was pacing around their room. The floorboards creaked just like they did in my forest house. I imagined the loggers' surprise when they found it. There were so many things in there: tools, clothes, a shelf with tattered books, some canned goods, and even a bottle of vodka. But why demolish it entirely? If they needed a pit to dig sand or gravel, they could have done it 10 meters away. They could have used the house themselves. It wasn't too cramped even for adults. But what's the point of thinking about it now? And then, suddenly, I felt that familiar gaze upon me. The gaze of something unseen, incorporeal, yet immense. Is that you? Are you here? I whispered into the darkness of the night. Yes, it replied. What do you want? I've come to thank you. For what? I didn't understand. I've come to thank you. When you came to the forest and started building your house, I became curious. I watched you. I asked why you built the house, and you explained it to me. And then I decided to try it myself. What? Try what? Try building a house too. One of my roommates muttered in his sleep and stirred but didn't wake up. Maybe he didn't hear my visitor. Maybe only I could hear it. And its voice suddenly changed. The bored tone disappeared, replaced by, was it inspiration? I always wandered, traveled. I thought people built houses because they were cold and scared. I never felt cold or fear, so I never needed a house. But you explained to me why you built your house, so I decided to try building one too. I built it there, in my world. It's not like yours, it's different. It has walls outside, a roof on top, and things inside. Yes, many things. And when I return to it, I feel cozy. This confession scared me a little but also warmed my heart. Such an alien being, and yet it had found a home. It might have been fitting to end the story here. It would have been a nice tale about how a restless teenager met a forest spirit and taught it something human. But no, the story doesn't end there. My house is gone, I sighed. The forest was logged, and it was demolished. Your house is safe, my invisible companion replied. When they started cutting down the forest, I moved it to my world. What? I was stunned. Where to your world. It didn't answer my question. Instead, it said, "Now I want to thank you. I want to give you a gift. Stretch out your left hand." Why the left one? I wondered, but pulled my hand out from under the blanket, cupping it, expecting something to fall into it. I felt a light, thin pain in my wrist, like being cut by a thread. Suddenly, the room was filled with the sharp scent of blood. With my right hand, I grabbed the spot where my left hand's wrist had been and screamed. There was chaos, terrified roommates, paramedics, the police. Back then it was still the militia. My left hand was never found. To all their questions, I answered that I was asleep, didn't see or hear anything, woke up from the pain, hadn't quarreled with anyone, and noticed no suspicious individuals. In the end, the authorities concluded that some madman had sneaked into the dorm, bypassed the guard, unlocked the locked door, chopped off my hand with either a very sharp axe or a very large and equally sharp knife, locked the door behind him, and escaped before the commotion began. Not the worst version, really. It's no less plausible than the version where a forest spirit took my hand as thanks for inspiring it to build a home. Why did it do it? I pondered for a long time without finding an answer. Why specifically my left hand? Maybe I had, I don't know, a deadly cancer of the fingernails, and it sensed it and saved me? Or maybe it could see the future and knew I was destined to fail my exams, drop out of university, get drafted, and die in the army, so it decided to make me an invalid and thus forever sever my ties with the military enlistment office? I didn't fail my exams, though. On the contrary, I passed them quickly and aced them. The professors, perhaps, took pity on me because of my missing hand, or maybe I wasn't so dumb after all. Not for nothing did I spend my childhood buried in libraries. The last of my neighbors, a mediocre student and a slacker, finally passed his last exam and went home for the summer, leaving me alone in the dorm room. On the entire floor, only I and one other student remained, a senior orphan who had nowhere else to go. He and I grabbed a couple of beers, settled on a wide windowsill, and spent the evening in pleasant conversation. I returned to my room, locked the door, and lay on the bed on top of the blanket without undressing. I wasn't sleepy, just relaxed from the beer, so I decided to lie down with my eyes closed. The stump healed quickly and barely hurt, no phantom pain the doctors had warned me about, but just in case, I crossed my arms over my chest so that if I did drift off, I wouldn't accidentally press on it. Just like in a sleeping bag, I remembered. That's how I used to sleep. And suddenly, I felt I wasn't lying on the sagging bed in the dorm, but on hard wooden planks, smelling not of peeling wallpaper, instant soup, and my dirty socks, but of pine resin, a smoky stove, and damp earth. I opened my eyes and saw the slate roof of my forest house above me. I jumped up from the couch and looked around. Yes, there was no mistake. I was back. The same walls covered in packing cardboard, the stove with its rusty pipe, the shelf filled with books swollen from the high humidity, the table made from crates, and on the table. Instinctively, I raised my hands to rub my eyes in disbelief and discovered that my left hand was intact. I spread my fingers, clenched them into a fist, moved them, it all worked as it should. But what shouldn't have been there was what lay on the table, the severed hand of my left arm, with a pool of blood beneath it. How? How is it both here and there? And how did I even? I muttered to myself, squeezed my eyes shut, and when I opened them, I was back in the dormitory. Getting up, I paced the room, nervously rubbing the stump where just a moment ago, a moment that felt so real, my hand had been. No, it wasn't a dream. Gradually, I began to understand what the forest spirit had gifted me. I took a few deep breaths to gather my courage, lay back on the bed, and closed my eyes. And everything repeated itself. Many years have passed since then. I've grown up, gotten married, and have a daughter. My daughter has her own room, decorated just the way she likes it, and I never enter without knocking. I've built a house, a cozy little cottage on the outskirts of the city. My wife and daughter love it, and so do I, but still, my real home is only one. Wherever I am, as soon as I lie down, close my eyes, and think of it, I find myself there. Time stands still there, the severed hand remains on the table, the blood beneath it hasn't even darkened, and I am always 18, the age I was when I lost my hand. I sit on the couch, rereading the battered books on the makeshift shelf for the 100th time, sometimes lighting the stove, not for warmth, it isn't cold there, but for comfort. The firewood never runs out. Every time I return, it's all there, and I've memorized each log. Sometimes, I step out of the house. It's surrounded by forest, a patch about 10 meters around the house, the ground replaced by a pit. Beyond that lies only a flat desert of lifeless gray sand. I don't like looking up. The sky there is ugly, dull, with no visible sun, and the clouds form nauseating patterns that remind me of my mother's abstract paintings. And about 100 meters away stands another house. It doesn't look like mine, it's different. It has walls on the outside, a roof on top, and, presumably, things inside, but I don't want to know what's in there, because just one glance at it from a distance makes me tremble. Once, I came a little closer to that house. "Hello," a voice said.